Today we learn how to win friends. This book itself has won a particularly large number of friends. It was published in 1936, shortly after the ancient Romans and dinosaurs, I guess, and it has sold millions of copies worldwide since then. And today it still appears in bestseller lists. Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that's what we're going to look at today. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today we're going to have a book review of another classic, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. The oldest book reviewed on this channel to date. Dale Carnegie was a lecturer and author of self-help books. And two of his books were particularly successful. This one, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. How to Win Friends and Influence People was published in 1936 and it is based on a lecture given by Dale Carnegie at that time on a regular basis that was also quite successful. It has sold millions of copies worldwide, and according to Wikipedia, it even founded the entire genre of self-help literature. It was the very first book of its kind. This recent editions of the book have been revised and adapted to modern times according to the preface. One thing I found surprising, we had a look at some other older books before, and in some cases over the years and over the course of several editions, additional materials had been added to those books, such as an additional chapter. However, in Carnegie's books, two sections from the original edition have actually been omitted in later ones. They were called Letters That Produced Miraculous Results and 7 Rules for Making Your Home Life Happier. I don't know why those were removed. This recent edition of the book is divided into 4 parts, and each part contains several chapters. At the end of each chapter we have a principle, where Carnegie sums up his teachings in 1 sentence each. And this principle is explained and showcased within the chapter by several anecdotes. So we have a lot of small stories where people applied the principle and they were successful doing so and achieved great results. A lot of those anecdotes deal with famous people of the time, including some American presidents. Several more of those anecdotes are about participants of the original lecture by Carnegie who later applied the principles in their own lives and were successful in doing so. And several anecdotes are about Carnegie himself, experiences from his own life. The first part of the book is called Fundamental Techniques in Handling People. And this is a very short part. It contains only 3 chapters and 3 principles. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain is the first one, and the second one is give honest and sincere appreciation. Those make sense because if you want other people to be friendly towards you and positive, it's better to approach them with praise and appreciation than criticism and judgment. The third principle is arouse in the other person an eager want. The general idea here is that we need to bait the hook to suit the fish rather than the fisherman. There is a nice anecdote here about a territory salesman for a big oil company who had several service stations in his territory, and one of those was run down and dirty and outdated and unpleasant, and it didn't generate a lot of profits. And he approached the manager and tried to convince the manager to upgrade and clean his service station and to make it nicer, to increase profits. However, the manager didn't want to hear about it and he didn't make any changes. So the territory salesman changed his approach. He invited the manager to visit the most modern, the newest service station in his territory, and the manager was astonished about how cool and modern and great it was. And the next time the territory salesman visited the rundown service station, he noticed that it had been cleaned up and was looking much nicer and more pleasant, and profits had started to increase. So in this first part, we really learn about some basics. The concepts explained here will appear again and again in the later parts of the book, and later principles are often based upon these very basic first ones. The second part of the book is called 6 Ways to Make People Like You. And the general idea here is to be interested in the other person, be responsive to the other person. Carnegie here advises us to show interest in the other person as well as in the other person's favorite topics, to make the other person feel important, to listen a lot, to let the other person do most of the talking and let the other person talk about themselves and their favorite topics, to always memorize their names and approach them in a positive way and to smile. In this part, we have a couple of anecdotes about the former American president Theodore Roosevelt, who was, it seems, very good at it. But one thing I found astonishing was that his valet wrote a book about him, Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote to his valet because Roosevelt was treating him and his wife so nicely and never top down, but always respectful and like friends and in a very positive manner. There is also a story about Roosevelt visiting the White House after his time in office, and he went around the White House and he greeted all the servants and he knew all of them. He knew their names and they were all happy to meet him again. The head usher of the White House even said it was the only happy day for us in almost 2 years. So quite a touching story. And another anecdote about Roosevelt concerns the fact that if he had guests the next day and the guests were interested in certain topics, he would read into those topics the night before so he could have a conversation with them about their favorite topics. I think this second part is still about the basics because the concepts explained here and the general idea of being interested in the other person and being responsive to the other person will also appear a lot in the later parts of the book. Part 3 is called How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. Here the basics are taken up and refined. A lot of the previous topics are repeated. It's again about being careful with criticism, about avoiding arguments, not attacking others, instead being responsive to other people, let other people do the talking, and about taking being serious about their ideas and wishes and viewpoints and about dealing with them in a positive way. And here influence also comes into play more strongly. We are advised to appeal to nobler motives in the other person, to let the other person say yes as often as possible, to set a challenge for them, to make them feel like it's their own idea if they do what we want. One advice given here is to dramatize our ideas, and there is a nice anecdote about a market researcher who had to do a study for a producer of cold cream, and he had to present the findings to the customer. And there were a lot of findings, a lot to present, but the customer asked about the methods, and they got sidetracked into a discussion of the methods. And in the end, he could convince the customer that the methods were fine. However, the time was up and he didn't really have a chance to present his findings. So in the next meeting with the customer, he changed his approach. He brought a suitcase full of jars of cold cream and he dumped them all onto the desk of the customer. And those jars of cold cream, they were all the competitors' products he had researched in the study. And onto each jar he had put a sticker with the most important facts and findings about that product. And when he did that, the customer looked at them and was interested and picked one up, picked another up, read the sticker, asked additional questions, and he had really focused the attention of the customer on the things that were important and that he wanted to present. So in the third part, the basic topics are repeated again, but they are built upon new concepts, new principles are based upon them, and the basic ideas are expanded. In the fourth and final part, it is called Be a Leader, How to Change People Without Giving Offense or Arousing Resentment. In this part, we again encounter the basics. Again, we are advised to be careful with criticism, to focus on praise and recognition, to let the other person save face, things like that. And here we also have a lot of topics from the third part repeated. For example, in both the third and the fourth part, there is a principle that deals with addressing our own mistakes and being open about our own mistakes and admitting our own mistakes. And in the third part, we had this principle that we should appeal to nobler motives. And in the fourth part, we have a principle that we should give the other party a fine reputation to live up to. Here we have an anecdote about a fourth grade teacher who learned at the beginning of the year that she had a known problem student in her new class. A guy, her colleague who had him in third grade, always complained about, who was causing a lot of issues. So what she did was this. The first time she encountered her new class, she addressed each of the children briefly and mentioned something that is important to this child, like, oh, Mark, I've learned that you are great at art and that you can draw especially well, and I'm looking forward to seeing your drawings. Or Sue, I learned that you are great at math and I'm looking forward to doing math with you. And when she came to the problem student, she said to him, oh, Tommy, I've learned that you are a natural leader and the others look up to you. So I'm relying on you to help me and support me in this year so it can be great for everybody. And after she had given him this fine reputation, he really did live up to it. He supported her and he was helpful and didn't cause problems. Now, as I said, this fourth part has a lot of similarities to the third part, maybe a bit of redundancies. And I wondered, maybe Carnegie's original idea was to have readers read those basic introductory chapters and after that select the advanced topic they are most interested in, such as part 3 for social life, part 4 for business and leadership, and this is probably where this chapter about happy family life did fit in. And maybe this is the reason it was removed, because it was too similar, too redundant to the other parts that are still there. Before we proceed to the critique, there is one question I'd like to clarify. In this book we learn how to influence people. So does this mean we learn how to manipulate people? How to get our way at the expense of other people? For that, it would probably be good to clarify what manipulation exactly is. However, this would be a bit too big a topic for this video. There will probably be a separate video about this in the future. For today, what I'd like to figure out is whether this book is about changing our attitude or about learning techniques. Because the result can be quite similar, but the reasons behind them are quite different. Imagine the following situation. A superior has some idle chit-chat with one of his employees. They are having some small talk. The reason for this situation to occur could be that this superior is really interested in his employees and he cares about them and he likes to get to know about them, about their thoughts, about the things they are interested in outside of work, and he enjoys having conversations with them, so he does it out of genuine interest. Another possible reason might be that this superior was told in some management seminar that by having small talk with his employees, he can give them the impression that he recognizes them as human beings, and this will raise their morale and increase their performance. And that's what he actually wants. He wants the increase in performance, and for that he puts up without listening to all that stuff he doesn't care about. So on one hand, we have a reason that is based on the attitude, that is based on a genuine wish, and on the other hand, we have a mere technique that is employed to gain a certain result, and this is what I'd consider manipulation. So, does Carnegie teach us a different attitude, or does he teach us tricks for manipulation? Carnegie himself says it is about attitude. He says at one point, the principles taught in this book will only work if they come from the heart. He says he doesn't care for a bag of tricks. He is about a new way of living. However, the actual chapters, the actual principles, sometimes, to me, seem to lean more toward manipulation. For example, in all those anecdotes we have in the book, the one who applies the principle obviously always gets his way, and it isn't of such big a concern whether this result is also satisfactory for the other party. This I especially noticed in one anecdote that is about Rockefeller giving a speech to workers on strike. And it is a nice speech and friendly and respectful, and the result is that the workers give up their strike and work again, even though he doesn't meet their demands. And I wonder if all those people went on strike, they probably had some legitimate demands and legitimate needs and concerns. And is it really a good result for them that their demands weren't met? I mean, Rockefeller is famous for his wealth. He could probably have paid them more. So this is one I'm really not sure about. And there are also a few principles that really are clearly techniques and tricks, such as the one where Carnegie says we should try to have the other party say yes as often as possible and agree as often as possible. So he is in a kind of agreeing mood, and when we put forward our request, he will also agree to that. And he doesn't even think about declining because he didn't do it all that time. And I can't really come up with any reason for doing something like this that is rooted in a positive, healthy attitude. So I guess this really is a trick, a piece of manipulation. And another thing that, kind of pulls the scale towards manipulation here is this general approach of Carnegie to be not very open about things and to be very diplomatic and careful what you say. For example, not to openly voice criticism, but put it forth in a very indirect and diplomatic way. At another point, he advises us not to give orders, but instead to make suggestions. And there is a lot of that in the book about this indirect and diplomatic approach. And of course, it makes sense on one hand, but on the other hand, this also clearly has some manipulative aspects because you aren't really open with the other person. So bottom line, I think in my personal opinion, this book is in a gray area. However, I'd say it leans more towards manipulation. However, I guess in the end, it depends on the individual reader. A reader who buys this book looking for manipulative tricks will probably find what he is looking for. However, a reader who genuinely wishes to improve his relationships and to change his attitude also won't be disappointed. I think if the book is read without the intent to learn manipulation, it is a nice book that promotes a positive attitude. One little drawback is that the great age of this book shows from time to time because some of Carnegie's advice by now has passed on into general knowledge and is so common and so widely used that it is nothing special anymore and not especially effective. This occurred to me especially in one anecdote that was about a woman who had to move for some reason and she needed a new job. So she wrote a letter to a couple of banks where she said, "My 10 years of banking experience will be of interest to a growing bank like yours," and so on, "and I'll be in the area shortly, and I would like to tell you how I can help you achieve your goals." And I guess a recruiter at that time would have been astonished by that letter saying, "Oh wow, look at that. This person doesn't just say, 'Please give me a job.' She really cares about us, about our needs, our concerns. This is great. I've never seen anything like that." However, a modern day recruiter wouldn't be impressed by such a letter at all because he receives cover letters like this by the dozens each day. Because nowadays all cover letters look pretty much like that and it is nothing special anymore. And I guess what contributes to this phenomenon is that Carnegie pretty much was in line with general trends and developments that occurred after his book. Because in the last couple of decades, for example, we overcame the authoritarian approach to leadership, to school education, to raising children. Nowadays, an authoritarian approach is considered outdated and we try to get over that. And this is pretty much in line with his idea of focusing on being nice and being interested and being friendly with the other person rather than being critical and using force. I guess this is also a reason this book held up so well and is still so popular. Another thing I noticed is a certain flabbiness. Some of the chapters, some of the principles are pretty much redundant, are very similar to each other. Some of the anecdotes might as well appear in a different chapter and they would still fit in perfectly because some of the principles are so similar to each other. So there is certainly some flabbiness. And I guess some of the topics are also to some point arbitrary, especially because Carnegie relies so heavily on anecdotes to make his points. Take, for example, an anecdote where someone is a great listener, he lets the other party do all the talking, the other party is happy, they become friends, everything is sold, everybody is happy. You might as well have an anecdote about a person who is a great speaker and a great storyteller, and he does all the talking, and his audience is astonished and enthusiastic, and in the end they become friends, everything is sold, everybody is happy, just the same result, but achieved by entirely different means that go in the totally opposite direction. Or in the same way, think about all this not being too open, not voicing criticism too clearly. One recent trend we have is called radical candor, that is about voicing criticism very clearly, openly, in an almost brutal way. And again, of course, they also have anecdotes about people who have their eyes opened by this open, honest feedback and to totally change their ways and manage to develop and improve themselves in ways they didn't think possible. So again, totally opposite direction, because you will always find an anecdote that proves your point. One fun fact about the book: Carnegie believed pretty much that we were highly predestined, predetermined, which is no surprise actually, because his book was published about 10 years before Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and Frankl contributed heavily to the idea of self-determination and self-efficacy, but I still found it interesting that Carnegie really doesn't have that. At one point he says, if there is a person and we think, oh, this is an awful person, we should keep in mind, if we had this person's genes and this person's upbringing, we would have turned exactly like that person. So if we had Al Capone's genes and Al Capone's upbringing, we all would have become gangster bosses. The idea of free choice and self-determination really wasn't there yet, and I found this quite interesting. Finally, a few words about the book's structure and this particular edition. What I found a bit weird is that in each part of the book, Carnegie starts the numbering anew. So in each part we have chapter 1 and principle 1. And so I found this a bit weird, especially for the principles. I would have expected to have an ongoing list that includes all principles in a common order. But it's no big deal, of course. And I also found the book's final chapter a bit confusing, because all the other chapters are anecdotes, principle, anecdotes, principle. However, in the final chapter, between anecdotes and principle, we have a list of things we should do, about 6 points on that list of further advice, again similar to the other things, principles. So it's like a few mini principles in between the anecdotes and actual principle. It's a bit strange, but again, no big deal. This specific edition I was quite disappointed of. It is a rather small book overall, and as you can see, the text is rather small. There is very little line spacing, and the page borders are very small as well, and this makes it difficult because the text tends to disappear into the crack, and it's difficult to read. By chance, I had an ebook edition of this book before I bought this physical copy, and I started reading the ebook, and when this copy arrived, I had a brief look at it, and then I said, oh no, I'm going to stick to the ebook. This is no enjoyable reading. If you have read the book and the probability isn't that low, how did you like it? Did it help you create better relationships with other people? Did you find it to be a bag of tricks for manipulation, or really a promotion of a positive attitude? Let me know in the comments. I'm looking forward to your feedback. If you enjoyed the video, I would also appreciate a like. And if you would like to become our YouTube friends, please subscribe to the channel. We would be quite happy to have you as a subscriber. We will see each other next week in the next channel update. For today, I take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.